The cold wind howled through the Wyoming plains, swirling the snow into a blinding curtain. Dust Creek, a small town that barely stood on the map, was bitterly frozen in the winter of 1887. The train station was empty, except for a lone figure, Evelyn Hart, a young woman with a baby bundled tightly in her arms. Her face, pale and drawn, barely registered the chill as the bitter winds whipped against her. But it was the sting of abandonment that cut deepest. She stood alone, the last train pulling away in the distance, its steam vanishing like her fleeting hope. She had come here with nothing. No money, no future, only a promise from a man who had been nothing more than a liar, abandoning her without a word, leaving her stranded at the edge of nowhere with only her baby for company. She had trusted him, let him fill her heart with dreams of a future. But now, all she had was a frozen platform, a crying infant, and an empty world that turned its back on her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from fear, the kind that comes with having nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The streets of Dust Creek were barren, the houses small and far apart. She could hear the wind, but no voices. She was no longer a part of the town's story, just a forgotten chapter in someone else's life. As she held her baby tighter, tried to keep warmth between them, Evelyn stumbled. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was sinking, and her vision blurred as she gasped for breath. A small tear slid down her cheek, not from the cold, but from the weight of despair. It seemed like the world was pushing her to the edge, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. But just as she felt herself giving in, a shadow fell across her. It was Richard Avery, tall and strong, with a scar running across his jaw that gave him the look of someone who had seen hard times. He stood there silently, a man of few words, his dark eyes scanning the scene before him. The wind howled louder, but his presence seemed to cut through it. "You need work." His voice was rough, low, like the rumbling of distant thunder. Evelyn looked up, unsure whether this was another person who might turn their back on her or someone who might offer a hand. She swallowed, desperate, and nodded. "I can cook, clean, anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The lie felt strange on her tongue, but what else could she say? The words were her last lifeline, even if they weren't true. Richard looked at her for a long moment, his gaze heavy with doubt. "Can you?" he asked, the question more of a challenge than a concern. Evelyn swallowed again, a lump in her throat, and clutched her baby tighter. "I'll learn," she promised. "Please, my baby, I need this." Her voice cracked, the desperation bleeding through the calm she tried to maintain. Richard studied her for another moment before he nodded. "I need a cook. Room, board, $10 monthly." "I'll take it." She said the words quickly, without hesitation and without thought. Without another word, Richard turned and walked toward his wagon. Evelyn hesitated, unsure if this was just another person offering false hope. But as she followed him, something about his quiet demeanor gave her a strange sense of safety. He wasn't offering rescue, she realized. He was offering a chance, a small window to survive. The wagon was cold, the wood creaking under their weight as they made their way away from the train station and toward the unknown. The journey stretched on for what felt like hours. The landscape outside was barren, the snow covering everything in a soft, white blanket. Richard didn't speak, and neither did she. The silence between them was thick, but Evelyn couldn't bring herself to break it. She had nothing left to say. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the ranch appeared, a small, isolated place nestled among snow-covered mountains. It was beautiful in its own way, but the isolation made her stomach twist. There was nothing here but silence, nothing but the promise of hard work and an unforgiving world. Richard led her to a small cabin, sparsely furnished with only the essentials. He showed her the kitchen with its temperamental stove and the well out back that she would have to draw water from. It was simple, practical, but it felt like a prison in the making. Her new life was about to begin, but it was clear from Richard's eyes that there were no promises here, just expectations. "This is yours," he said, showing her a small room off the kitchen. It was bare, but it was hers. "I eat at dawn and dusk. I don't want excuses. Understand?" Evelyn nodded silently, too tired to argue or even speak. The silence stretched out as Richard stood in the doorway, waiting for her response. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. She had lied. She didn't know how to cook. She had never cooked in her life. The realization hit her hard as she closed the door behind him. She had lied to survive. And now survival meant not starving the man who had taken her in. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a chance at love. It was business. And Jane Hart, Evelyn, she reminded herself, had better learn how to cook, or she'd be left with nothing. As she sat on the edge of the small bed, holding her baby close, she couldn't help but wonder if this was all some cruel twist of fate. But she didn't have time to dwell on that. Morning would come, and with it, the responsibility she had chosen. But she wasn't ready, not by a long shot. The beans were never the problem. She'd lied to survive. Now survival meant not starving the man who saved her. The first morning after she arrived, Evelyn stood in front of the wood stove, trembling. The kitchen was small, the stove old and temperamental, and she had no idea how to cook. She had never done it before. Her hands shook as she attempted to make porridge, but quickly burned, filling the kitchen with smoke. Richard walked in, his heavy boots clicking against the floor, and he looked at the charred mess she had made. Without a word, he took a spoonful and chewed slowly, his face unreadable. The silence stretched on, and Evelyn could feel the weight of her failure. Finally, Richard set the fork down, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll eat in town today," he said, turning to leave without a hint of anger, just disappointment. Evelyn stood frozen, holding the baby to her chest, her heart sinking. She had promised herself she wouldn't fail him, but in that moment, she was nothing but a failure. That afternoon, she found herself sitting by the window, staring out at the bleak winter landscape. The memory of her past flashed in her mind, of her father's rejection when she became pregnant. He called her a disgrace, told her she had no name, no future. Her mother had said nothing, just silently let her go. Evelyn was a forgotten woman, abandoned by the man who promised marriage, left with only her baby and an uncertain future. But this was her last chance. She couldn't afford to fail. Over the next few days, the disasters continued. On the second day, she made beans, but they were as hard as stones, undercooked, and Richard ate them all anyway, chewing slowly without a word. On the fourth day, she baked bread, but it came out like a brick. She couldn't even cut it with a knife, and Richard's voice was quiet but cutting when he said, "I'll hire a better cook soon." His words were a dagger in her heart, and she could only nod silently, knowing he was right. She had no idea what she was doing. On the sixth day, she tried making stew, but it was watery and tasteless. Richard added salt without tasting it, as though he had given up on even pretending it was worth eating. And on the eighth day, the coffee was undrinkable, with grounds floating in the cup. Richard drank it anyway, his jaw clenched in silent resignation. He never yelled at her, never expressed his frustration outright. He simply ate what she made, and every day, the silence between them grew heavier. But there were small mercies that kept her going. Every morning, when she woke, the wood was already stacked beside the stove. The well had been filled, and the fire had been started before dawn. Richard didn't speak of it, but his actions told a story. He wasn't angry with her. He was disappointed, but he was trying, in his own way, to show that he cared. She overheard him one evening in the barn, muttering to himself, "Can't keep this up much longer." The fear in his voice cut through her like a blade. He was planning to replace her. Evelyn felt the weight of his unspoken words, and her heart sank. He was kind, but there was only so much kindness he could give. Then, the baby's fever came, and everything changed. She'd been counting the days until Richard would finally tell her to leave, but the night her son fell ill, she stopped counting. It was the third week at the ranch, and Evelyn had just fallen into the rhythm of things, even if it was far from perfect. She had learned some tricks with the stove, and every meal wasn't a complete disaster anymore. But she wasn't fooling herself. She knew Richard wasn't happy with her progress, and she saw the weariness in his eyes every time he came home to another botched dinner. Still, that night was different. Evelyn woke in a cold sweat, the baby's cries piercing the stillness of the night. She reached out instinctively, feeling his little body burning with fever. His cries grew weaker, and his body seemed limp in her arms, like all the life was draining out of him. Panic seized her chest, and she couldn't breathe. She knew nothing about fevers, nothing about sickness. She only knew that her baby, her only reason for fighting, was slipping away from her. She wrapped him in a blanket and stumbled out of the room, her mind racing with fear. She barely registered the cold air as she ran toward the barn, barefoot in her nightgown, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard was there, as always, mucking the stalls, his back to her as he worked. She reached him in a blur of panic, her voice trembling as she screamed, "Please, something's wrong with him." Richard turned at the sound of her voice, his expression hardening into one of quiet determination. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he dropped his pitchfork and grabbed the baby from her arms, his rough hands gentle as he wrapped the child in wool and leather. "Hold him tight," he ordered, his voice firm and calm the face of her terror. He hitched up the horse to the wagon quickly, working with a practiced efficiency that made Evelyn realize how much he had done for himself in the years he had been alone. She scrambled onto the wagon beside him, clutching her baby to her chest as Richard guided the horse into motion. The journey through the snowstorm was long and grueling. The wind howled, and the snow swept over them in blinding waves. The road was treacherous, and Evelyn had no idea where they were heading, but she didn't care. She just needed to get the baby to someone, anyone who could help. Richard drove with a calm, steady hand, his jaw set, his face hard with concentration. Evelyn watched him, feeling a strange mix of awe and gratitude. She had seen his quiet strength before, but now, in the face of her son's suffering, it was clearer than ever. He didn't speak, didn't complain about the freezing cold or the endless hours of driving through the storm. He didn't even mention how tired he must have been, how much he had already given. He just kept driving, his focus unshakable. Evelyn's heart swelled with a new understanding of him, and she realized something in that moment. Richard cared. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it to be true. He wasn't just helping because she worked for him. He was helping because, despite everything, he cared. They finally reached the doctor's cabin after what felt like an eternity, the horse's hooves barely cutting through the deep drifts. The doctor was an old man, his hair thinning and his hands shaking with age, but he moved quickly and efficiently. He examined the baby under the dim light of a lantern, muttering to himself as he worked. Evelyn stood by, her hands trembling, her heart lodged in her throat. When the doctor finally looked up, his expression softened. "Just a fever," he said, his voice gravelly. "Good thing you came when you did. If he'd gone longer, it could have been worse." Relief flooded through Evelyn, and she almost collapsed with the weight of it. Richard, though, didn't let his guard down. He stepped forward and paid the doctor without question, the amount of small fortune for a man like Richard. "Take care of him," the doctor told them, handing Evelyn back her baby. The journey back was quieter. The storm had calmed, and the sky had cleared, revealing a starry night that made everything feel still and peaceful. Evelyn held her son close, watching his steady breathing as he slept against her chest. Richard drove the wagon slowly, his hands resting on the reins, his body slightly hunched as if he were carrying a heavy load. Evelyn didn't speak, but she reached out to touch his arm, just once to thank him. She could see the tension in his back, the lines of weariness that had begun to show after weeks of taking on the responsibility of two people and a baby. When he spoke, his voice was rough, but there was a softness there that she hadn't noticed before. "You don't thank someone for doing right," he said quietly, his eyes on the road ahead. It was the first time he had really spoken to her like this, without the guarded walls that had been so firmly in place since they first met. Evelyn smiled faintly, her heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. She had come to this place with nothing, with no one. She had lied to survive, had made herself into something she wasn't just to find a place, a life, a reason to stay alive. And now, in the quiet of the wagon, with the stars overhead and her baby safely asleep between them, she realized she was no longer alone. She wasn't just surviving anymore. For the first time, she was living. When they arrived back at the ranch, Richard helped her inside, and the silence that had settled between them seemed different now. There was no awkwardness, no tension. He went straight to the kitchen and started the fire, stoking the embers with careful hands. For the first time since she'd arrived, he made her tea, without being asked, without any fanfare. "Rest," he said, his voice soft. "I'll manage today." Evelyn sat in the chair by the fire, her eyes following him as he worked. For the first time, she saw him for what he truly was. Not just a stern employer, but a man who had suffered, who carried his own burdens in silence. And she saw the care he took, the care he had given her and her baby, without ever asking for anything in return. She had been counting the days until he would send her away, but she realized now that she had been wrong. This wasn't just a job. It was something more, something that could become real. He wasn't her rescuer, and she wasn't his servant. There was something else entirely. In the morning, when she woke to the smell of breakfast, it wasn't the same. Richard stood by the stove, his back to her, as he stirred something in a pot. He didn't look over, but she could see his shoulders tense slightly when he realized she was awake. Slowly, cautiously, he turned to face her. "Stove needs more kindling in winter," he said, his tone practical, but not unkind. "Like this." He showed her, without criticism, how to manage the fire better. And from that moment on, he began teaching her in small, quiet ways. It wasn't condescending, just simple lessons like soaking beans overnight or letting bread rise by the fire, or using eggshells in coffee to make it taste better. Each day, she grew a little more confident. The meals weren't perfect, but they were edible. And sometimes when she brought him his plate, he would take a bite and nod, his mouth twitching slightly. She didn't know if he was smiling, but she liked to think that he was. And maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to change. The shift in their dynamic was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but it was undeniable. Richard had saved her son, and in doing so, he had saved Evelyn from herself, from the shame and desperation that had defined her life for so long. Now it seemed he was saving her in a quieter, more subtle way, one lesson at a time, one meal at a time. The mornings were still cold, the air crisp with winter's bite, but they no longer felt as harsh. The early hours found her at the stove, the fire crackling beneath the pot as she worked to master the delicate art of cooking. Richard had shown her how to tend to the fire, how to stoke it just right to get the right heat for the stove. And slowly, things began to improve. The first time she made beans that weren't hard as rocks, Richard took a bite and actually paused. He didn't rush to spit them out or shove them aside. Instead, he chewed thoughtfully and then nodded, barely saying anything at all. But to Evelyn, that small moment felt like a victory. She wasn't a failure anymore. She was learning, and she was beginning to understand the rhythm of the kitchen. The bread, once as tough as stone, started to rise properly. The stew, though still not perfect, began to taste like something real. Richard never said much, but his actions spoke volumes. He ate more slowly, savoring the food in a way he hadn't before. Sometimes, when the meal was particularly good, he'd look at her, not with a critical eye, but with curiosity, asking, "What's in this?" It was the first time he'd ever asked about her cooking. It was the first time Evelyn realized he wasn't just tolerating her food. He was genuinely interested in it. There was a tenderness in his voice, something she hadn't heard before, and it made her heart swell with the realization that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just putting up with her. He was starting to see her, to value her in a way that went beyond the cook she had been hired to be. Days turned into weeks, and Evelyn found herself settling into a rhythm she had never known before. She became more confident in the kitchen, more certain of her place in the small world they had built together. Richard, though he said little, was there beside her every step of the way, a steady presence. There was something quiet and comforting about the way he helped without ever being asked, always ensuring the wood was stacked by the stove in the mornings, the well was full, the fire was started before she even woke. In the evenings, he'd sit by the fire, whittling small bits of wood, while Evelyn hummed softly as she worked. The baby, now a little older, crawled across the floor between them, playing with whatever he could find. It felt like home. At times, when she wasn't looking, she would catch Richard's gaze lingering on her, a softness in his eyes that made her chest tighten with something she couldn't name. She would look away quickly, not wanting to acknowledge the warmth in her heart. She had come here thinking she was just a woman in need of work, but now she realized that she was something more. She was a part of this place, part of his life in a way she hadn't expected. The days grew longer, the seasons shifted, and with them, their routine became more than just survival. It became something more tangible, more real. The daily tasks of cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the baby were no longer burdens. They were steps in building a life, in creating something together. Richard would sometimes glance over at her while she worked, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet respect there, a sense that he no longer saw her as the desperate woman who had stumbled into his life. He saw her as part of his world, as someone who belonged. Evelyn began to notice small gestures that spoke volumes. One evening, she noticed his shirt had a tear in it. Without asking, she mended it, working by the light of the oil lamp. The next morning, she found that her broken chair had been fixed. No words, just action. It was the unspoken language between them, a language of care, a language that didn't need words to be understood. They were building something together, something real, something lasting. And yet, despite the quiet moments of intimacy that were beginning to form between them, Evelyn couldn't ignore the nagging thought that kept creeping into her mind. She was falling for him. She couldn't help it. The way he cared for her baby, the way he fixed the things she'd never noticed, the way he simply was strong, quiet, steady, drew her in. But she knew this could never last. She was still the woman with the bastard child, the woman abandoned by her lover and thrown into this life. Richard was still her employer, and no matter how kind he was, no matter how much he seemed to care, she could never allow herself to believe that anything could ever come of it. The town still whispered when they went for supplies, their looks sharp and judgmental. Richard was a man who deserved better than her, a man who had the right to choose a proper woman to share his life with. And yet, despite everything she told herself, despite the warnings in her head, she couldn't stop herself from longing for something more. She couldn't help but watch him when he wasn't looking, noticing the little things, the way he moved so effortlessly, the quiet strength in his hands as he worked. And when he looked at her, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. It was tenderness, yes, but there was also something else there, something she didn't dare to hope for. And so, she kept her distance, pushing away the feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. She told herself that this was just temporary, that she was just passing through his life, and when the time came, she would leave without a word. But even as she told herself that, she knew it wasn't true. They were building something real together, something that was slowly weaving its way into both their lives. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, It was becoming harder to imagine a life without him. The danger, of course, was that Richard might feel the same way. And that, she knew, was a risk she couldn't afford to take. She couldn't let herself fall any deeper, because in the end, she would be the one who destroyed them both. So, she kept to her routine, focusing on the daily tasks, letting the quiet intimacy between them grow, all the while knowing that the moment she let herself get too comfortable, too hopeful, everything would come crashing down. Because the truth was, she was falling in love with Richard Avery, and there was no way to stop it. But then, one day, a knock at the door would shatter everything she thought she knew about her place in this life. She found peace in his silence, in the quiet, unspoken moments where she no longer had to prove herself to Richard. She had stopped counting the days when he might fire her, stopped worrying about whether or not she would be good enough. She had started to believe that maybe she wasn't just a failure. Maybe she could stay here with him and the baby and make a life. But she was wrong. Everything she had allowed herself to hope for was about to come crashing down. One early spring morning, as she was setting the table for breakfast, she heard the familiar sound of a knock at the door. It was a sound she had come to associate with peaceful mornings and quiet routines, but today, it felt different. The knock was urgent, demanding attention, and her stomach twisted with the sense that something was wrong. Richard was outside in the barn, as usual, and she hesitated for a moment before walking to the door. She opened it slowly, her hand on the latch, not knowing what to expect. Standing on the other side was a man in a fine coat, his boots polished and his hat sharply creased. He was well-dressed, well-groomed, and there was an unmistakable coldness in his eyes that made Evelyn's heart skip a beat. She felt a chill run down her spine as the man looked her up and down, a sneer curling on his lips. "I'm looking for Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice sharp and precise. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure what to say or do. The name was hers, but it wasn't a name she used here. Not anymore. She had buried her past, and with it, the person she had once been. Richard had never asked about her past, and she had never volunteered any information. She had given him a different name when she arrived, hoping that the past would remain buried. But now, standing before this stranger, it felt like that past had found her once again. Her mind raced as she searched for words, but nothing came. She had no idea who this man was or how he had found her, but she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She stepped back instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. Before she could say anything, Richard appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the space with a quiet strength that made the stranger pause. Richard's dark eyes studied the man for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly. He didn't speak, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. "No one here by that name," Richard said calmly, his voice low but firm. Evelyn's stomach dropped as she heard his words. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew that the man who stood before her wasn't just a stranger. He was here for a reason. The man's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. "The girl with the bastard child," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I know she's here." Evelyn's knees went weak, and she could feel the color drain from her face. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. This was the past she had tried to outrun, the shame she had carried with her all this time. This man, this was someone from her past, someone who knew the truth. She didn't want to hear any more, but she couldn't stop herself from listening as he continued. "I'm Charles Linton," he said, his voice cold and unfeeling. "I'm the brother of the man who abandoned you. And that baby, he's family blood, my brother's shame." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt her legs give way beneath her. This man, Charles Linton, was the brother of the man who had promised her everything and then disappeared without a trace. The man who had left her stranded with nothing, with no hope. The man who had never cared for her or her baby. And now, his brother had come to take her child, to erase any trace of her from the world. The thought made her sick to her stomach. Charles's smile twisted as he looked at her. That baby is going to a proper home. An orphanage mission south. I'll take him, and you'll be gone from this town. You're nothing but a disgrace, and I won't let that bastard grow up with the likes of you. The words cut through her like a blade, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, how to defend herself, how to keep her son from being taken away. She had always known that her past would catch up with her eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. Richard stood between them, his body tense, his eyes dark with anger. "You need to leave. Now," he said, his voice calm but forceful. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. "What do you have to protect her, cowboy? You think you can just play house with a woman like her? She's a ruined woman. What do you think the law will say when I show them who she really is?" Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "You'll leave now, or I'll make you leave." Charles's eyes gleamed with malice, and he took a step closer. "I have blood rights," he sneered. "What does she have? Nothing. You can't protect her. You can't protect that bastard. The sheriff will side with family law, and you'll have no say in it." With a final sneer, Charles turned on his heel and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silent house. Evelyn stood frozen, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had known, deep down, that her past wasn't truly gone, but this was something she hadn't anticipated. The man who had left her to fend for herself now had a brother who was coming to take her son away. Richard stepped forward, his hand on her shoulder, and she could feel the weight of his presence beside her. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "No one is taking your child. Not while I'm here." But the doubt in his eyes told a different story. The law wasn't on their side. Richard had no claim to the baby, and Evelyn had no legal standing. She was a woman without a name, a woman without any rights. Charles would return with the sheriff, and when that happened, everything would fall apart. She collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling as she held her baby close to her chest. The thought of losing him, of having him taken away, was more than she could bear. Richard stood beside her, silent, but his presence was a comfort. He had always been strong, always been steady, but now, for the first time, Evelyn saw the cracks in his armor. He didn't know what to do. Neither of them did. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to speak. Richard didn't try to comfort her with empty words. Instead, they sat in silence, the weight of the situation hanging between them like a dark cloud. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Richard spoke. "I had a wife, Caroline." His voice was rough, his eyes dark with the memory. "And a daughter, Emma." Evelyn turned to him, surprised. He had never shared anything personal before, and now, for the first time, she understood why. The pain in his eyes was raw, and she could see that the loss had shaped him, had hardened him into the man she had come to know. Fever took them both. 3 years back, he continued, his voice tight. "This ranch was supposed to be for Emma. I wanted her to grow up here, to have a home. But when they died, I stopped talking much. Didn't see the point." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. "When I saw you at that station, with that baby, I saw what I lost. I didn't hire you because I needed a cook. I hired you because this house needed life again." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes filling with tears. She had never realized how much pain Richard carried with him, how much he had lost. She had always seen him as strong, as unmovable, but now, in this moment, she saw the man behind a mask. "He's got my Emma's eyes," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Evelyn reached out, her hand finding his, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Richard's voice broke through the stillness. "I won't let them take him. Or you." Evelyn looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and fear. She couldn't leave him, not now, not after everything he had done for her. But she also knew the danger. She was a woman without a name, a woman who had no rights. Richard's reputation, his ranch, his future, they were all at risk because of her. She couldn't let him pay the price for her past. And so, in the dead of night, before he could stop her, she made the decision. She would leave. She would protect him, protect them both by disappearing. The shame of her past would not destroy Richard's future. And so, before dawn broke, Evelyn took her baby and slipped out of the cabin, leaving behind the only place that had ever felt like home. But Richard Avery wasn't a man who let go easily. He would follow her, and he wouldn't stop until he had her back. Evelyn thought leaving would save him. She thought that by slipping away before the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains, she could protect Richard, the ranch, and their fragile, growing bond from the threat of her past. She had taken her baby, leaving behind only a note, words that she hoped would explain why she was leaving, words that she hoped would make it easier for him to understand. The note was simple, but in it, she poured all the fear and pain that had driven her decision. I cannot let my shame destroy you. You gave me dignity. Thank you for teaching me I was worth something. Forgive me. Jane. She had barely been able to read the words through the tears that blurred her vision, but she had left them on the table by the stove, hoping he would somehow understand that her leaving was the only way to protect him. The snow had fallen softly during the night, and the morning was still and quiet as she stepped out into the cold, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The weight of her decision settled heavily on her shoulders as she walked, baby in arms, down the mountain road. She knew Richard would never allow this, knew he would never let her go without a fight, but she couldn't stay. It was better for him, better for them all if she left now, before things got any worse. It was better if she was gone. But what she didn't count on was the relentless pursuit of a man who refused to be abandoned. Richard was no fool. As soon as he saw the note, he knew exactly what had happened. He crumpled it in his hand and stormed out of the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't need to read the words twice to understand what it meant. Evelyn had gone. She had taken his child, his hope, and vanished in the dead of night. It was a blow to his pride, to his heart, but worse than that, it was a blow to his belief in everything he had come to trust. She had walked away, and he wouldn't stand for it. Not now. Not after everything they had shared. His boots hit the snow-covered ground with a firm step, his breath coming out in heavy clouds as he saddled his horse without a moment's hesitation. He didn't care about the cold, didn't care about the danger of the mountain roads, didn't care about anything but finding her, bringing her back, and proving to her that she couldn't just slip away from him without consequences. The snowstorm had died down, but the winter air was still biting, and the road to town stretched endlessly before him. He didn't know where she had gone, didn't know if she had headed toward the nearest settlement or if she had ventured further into the mountains. But what he did know was that he wasn't going to stop until he found her. She couldn't just leave him. Not like this. Not without a fight. Richard pushed his horse faster, the animal's hooves cutting through the snow and ice with determination. The further he went, the harder the wind seemed to blow, but he didn't care. His mind was set. He wasn't going to let her go without hearing the truth. He wasn't going to let her leave him in silence. Evelyn, on the other hand, was already miles away by the time Richard saddled up and started after her. Her heart had broken with every step she had taken away from the ranch, but it was the only choice she had. She had no right to make Richard's life harder, no right to drag him down with the weight of her past. She had to keep running to protect him from the mess she had created, and most of all, to protect him from the law. As she walked down the narrow path, her thoughts were consumed with what was happening back at the ranch. She knew Richard wouldn't let her leave quietly, but what other choice did she have? She couldn't bear the thought of him facing the consequences of their relationship, of him losing everything he had worked for because of her. She couldn't let him fight her battles, not when she was the one who had made all the mistakes. The baby in her arms began to whimper, and Evelyn glanced down at him, her heart aching. She could feel the weight of his small body in her arms, and she realized in that moment that she had never truly been alone. Richard had been there for her in ways she had never expected, and he had given her something she hadn't even known she needed, a sense of belonging, of being valued. Now, as she stumbled down the mountain path, she knew she was leaving behind everything that had started to feel like home. She had made the decision, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like surrender. But there was no turning back. Or was there? The sound of hooves behind her cut through her thoughts like a knife, and she froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She already knew. Richard had found her. He was behind her, just as she had feared. She didn't want to face him, didn't want to hear the anger in his voice, didn't want to see the hurt in his eyes. But she couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pushing him away. Her knees felt weak, and she stumbled, nearly dropping the baby as she turned to face him. Richard had dismounted, his dark eyes locked on her with a mixture of determination and desperation. "Don't do this," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't leave me." Evelyn felt her heart break at the sight of him, at the pain in his eyes. She had wanted to protect him, wanted to keep him safe from the complications of her life, but standing here now, with him so close, she realized that she couldn't protect him from love. She couldn't protect him from herself. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't deserve this. You don't deserve my past. I can't bring that into your life. I can't ruin everything you've worked for." Richard took a step closer, his face softening with the realization of what she was saying. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. "You think you're the only one who has something to lose?" he said quietly. "You think I haven't lost everything before? You're not alone in this, Jane. I didn't hire you because I needed a cook. I hired you because I needed life in this place. I needed someone to help me remember what it was like to care again. And now I care about you." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined he could feel this way, had never thought that he might need her as much as she needed him. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Please don't leave me." The world seemed to stop in that moment, and for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the weight of the love that had slowly, unknowingly blossomed between them. It wasn't just a feeling of gratitude, of dependence, it was love, a deep, undeniable love. She had spent so long pushing him away, so long convincing herself that she wasn't worthy of his affection. But now, standing here with him, she knew she couldn't let him go. She couldn't lose him. "I can't do this without you either," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Richard reached out, pulling her into his arms. It was an embrace full of everything they had both been holding back: fear, hope, longing, and the realization that together they were stronger than apart. "We'll face this together," he said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil that had brought them here. "We'll fight for what's ours." As they stood there, holding each other, Evelyn knew that this was the beginning of something new, something that had nothing to do with the past she had tried so hard to outrun. This was a future built on love, on trust, and on the understanding that no matter what happened, they would face it side by side. The battle with Charles Linton was far from over, but in this moment, as she looked up into Richard's eyes, she knew they would fight it together. And no matter the outcome, it would be worth it. Together, they could face anything. Epilogue. A week later, Charles returned with the sheriff, but this time, Evelyn didn't flinch. Richard stood beside her as they waited on the porch, his arm around her waist. When Charles demanded the child, Richard pulled out a piece of paper, the marriage certificate they had signed just 3 days before. The sheriff examined it carefully, and after a moment of hesitation, he nodded. "Looks legitimate. Married woman has rights," he said, his voice calm but firm. Charles left in a huff, defeated. Evelyn turned to Richard, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You married me," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Richard smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I did. Would you have said no?" he asked with a smile. Evelyn laughed through her tears. No, never. 6 months later, in the same kitchen, Evelyn stood at the stove, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air, and the baby, now a toddler, sat in his high chair, eagerly reaching for his food. Richard entered, took a bite of the breakfast she had made, and grinned. "Damn, that's good," he said, his eyes twinkling with approval. "Remember when you said you'd hire a better cook?" Evelyn laughed. "I remember. You lied about those beans, though," she teased. "Those beans were terrible. Absolutely terrible." Richard agreed with a grin. They laughed together, and for the first time, Evelyn truly felt like she belonged. She had built something real here, something that was hers, something that was theirs. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, she knew that as long as they had each other, they would be able to face them together. "I love you, Jane Avery," Richard said softly, his voice full of tenderness. "I love you too," she replied, her heart full. They had come a long way from that first meeting at the train station, and together they had built a life that was worth fighting for. And as they stood together in the warmth of the kitchen, with their baby laughing between them, they knew they had found something that would last forever.